Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are looking forward to this next panel as much as I am. Please encourage your friends and colleagues to join us, and we'd like to get started. That was a very inspiring panel that just preceded us, and indeed an inspiring set of panels and conversations over the last few days. I think you know that the conversation this afternoon will focus on the question of scaling up. It's called Securing Rights, Securing Landscapes, Opportunities for Scaling Up the Recognition of Indigenous Peoples and Community Land Rights. And that's because we know that somewhere over 50% of the world's land is customarily used, claimed by indigenous peoples and communities, yet only around 10% is formally recognized. So you have a big gap between what is claimed and used and what is formally recognized. And we also know that that gap is the source of a lot of conflict and a lot of disruption, as well as illegal logging and criminalization and human rights abuse. Is a big problem, not only for local people primarily, but for the world and for the countries. So what we'll be talking about today is scaling up efforts to clarify land rights. And we're fortunate to have a fantastic panel, and we have all of you, a fantastic group of people, to help us think through this question of scaling up. What's the status? What more can be done, et cetera. So we're going to start with two esteemed guests on the panel, and that is my colleague, the Honorable Ellen Pratt, on my right. And the Honorable Pratt is a commissioner of the Liberian Land Authority, and she's responsible for developing the National Land Use Plan, national strategies to scale up the recognition of rights. No small feat. Ellen has degrees in planning. She's a member of the International Planning Association, Professional Association, and so she has spent a long time in Liberia and in the U.S. on working on these questions of land use, planning, and land rights. So we're very fortunate to have you, Ellen, with us. We also have with us on stage Abdon Nabadan. Abdon is a former Secretary General of AMAN. It's the National Federation of Indigenous Peoples of the Archipelago of Indonesia, and has been serving on the Council of AMAN since he left his post. His term ended several years ago. Very active internationally as well as nationally on these issues of land rights. So we've asked Ellen and Abdon to start the conversation with us today because they represent both a rights holder and a government, the two constituencies, if you will, that have the primary responsibility and duty to address these issues. They'll be joined subsequently by colleagues from the World Bank and also the Tenure Facility, and they represent organizations that are trying to help Abdon and the Commissioner Pratt deal with this question. So, but we're going to start with Abdon and Commissioner Pratt. And I'll ask them to say some words about how they see these issues. I'll ask them some questions, and then we'll turn to you, and you can ask them questions, and we have a conversation. And then I'll invite representatives from the bank and the Tenure Facility up on stage. So that's how we're going to roll. And I'm going to start off with a couple slides just to put to set the stage, so to speak, about this gap. This chart shows you just forests in lower middle income countries, the situation in 2002, what percentage of the developing country world's forests held by governments, designated for indigenous peoples, owned by indigenous peoples and communities, and finally the private household. So you see in 2002, almost 74% of developing country forests in the government hands. Only 1% designated for indigenous peoples, and 18% of developing country forests back then, and less than 7. So you see significant, but still the vast majority in the government hands. And indeed, it's the size of that column, it's this area here that is so contested. Because, of course, these are forests that are full of people, that have historic claims and rights and uses. And the challenge of what we're talking about today is how do governments work with their people to sort this out, and the tenure transition goes into these other columns, indigenous peoples and communities, and maybe some into the private households. So it's this tenure transition that we're discussing today and how to scale up global efforts. This is in 2008, so you see some shift in the right direction. This means that governments are sorting this out with their citizens and with their indigenous peoples. 2013, more progress. And then just last year, 2017, you see that it's dropped 10% globally. And then now, if you add this column, 24 and 4, it means that almost at least about 30% of developing country forests is now formally in the hands of communities. So good progress, but still a long ways to go, right? A lot to sort out. And this, of course, is global average. Some countries it's still a zero. Almost all forest is in the hands of the government and not yet sorted out. And so that's a really mixed picture. Significant that 90% of the change in the world in the last 10 years has been in lower middle income countries, and that this shift, this 10-year shift, is happening in over 30 countries. That means it's not just a one-off, one country is making progress. It's a wide social political step forward, a new norm that is emerging to respect rights. Not just one or two countries, it's abroad. That's good news. And the other thing to note is these are all percentages, but if you look at it in aggregate numbers, it's over 150 million hectares. It's like, I think, 4 times the size of Germany in the last 15 years. That's huge. That has shifted, in only 15 years, shifted from government to communities. It's a huge amount of land. The second thing to point out, and this is the last one I'll show as background, is the potential. So if you see from 2002 to 2017, 150 million hectares have shifted. If you just implement the new suite of laws and judicial decisions, Supreme Court decisions like in Indonesia, just implement those laws in 7 countries, it's another 176 million at least. At least. If you implement those laws in 10 countries, implement those laws in 20 countries, et cetera, then it's by just implementing existing laws, it would be over half developing country forests in the hands of local communities. So again, the question for us today is, how do we scale up our effort to close this gap between what's claimed and expected and deserved by communities and what's now recognized? How do we close this gap on implementation? Because again, at least 16 countries now have, since 2002, 16 countries have laws that, in Liberia is the latest one. Congratulations, Liberia. Path-breaking law for all of Africa, the most progressive. So how do we help the government of Liberia and its people to implement these laws? So that's really the question of today. So thank you for putting up with that somewhat long-winded introduction. And now we'd like to start with Abdon, and if I can find my notes. Abdon, if you can tell us about Indonesia this specific question for Indonesia. How much, what's the gap? What is your claim? And if you don't want to say, of course, you don't need to say that, but what is your vision, the indigenous people's vision in Indonesia? How much is recognized by the government now? Is anyone investing in helping close this gap? And if so, what does that look like? What are you learning from that investment? And then lastly, kind of what would you like to see more of? What do you think needs to be done to scale it up? Please, let us.
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, dear friend. So I will talk about Indonesia. Indonesia is a very huge country, 15,000 islands, but it's also, we have a rich biodiversity and also cultural, at least from our statistic, we have 1,128 ethnic groups. And these two, biodiversity and cultural diversity is inseparable, is really work together to protect Indonesia. So 10 years ago, we conducting our indicative mapping for indigenous peoples, and we come to the conclusions that Indonesia, at least, we have 84 million hectares indigenous territory, and 70 million hectares from that, what do you call it? The allocated by the government as a forest zone. And 40 million from our indigenous territory, 40 million hectares is a very good quality of forest of Indonesia. And 17 million, of course, is degraded forest that we need to restore. With that pictures, one that I need to tell you here, constitutionally, this territory is protected by our constitutions, but constitutions is different from what the reality, the legal reality and administrative systems that we have until now. We don't have the record, official record on this, We don't have the administrative system to put this indigenous territory. So that's why, for the last 20 years, we work hard to help the governments to mapping this land. Until last year, the end of last year, we already mapped and hand over the map to the governments about 10.24 million hectares. That we want the governments to include that maps into the one map policy. And from that 10.24 millions, actually, the governments, the national government said that we need the local legislations to help the central government to register this officially. And then we work with the local parliament, with local governments, and now we have local legislations in 10 provinces and 19 districts.
Wow.
So it's about 2.37 million hectares. So it's 23% from the 10.24 million that we already hand over to the government. But from this until last year, only 28,000 hectares that's fully recognized. Yeah, you see?
That's a gap.
So you can compare with 84 millions, the whole area, and also the map we already provide to the governments. Yeah, and with the high commitment from the presidents, and also the commitment from the Minister of the Environment and Forestry, we only got 28,000 hectares for the last 4 years. So what does it mean? Even there is a high-level commitment from the highest political and minister, it doesn't mean the problem is solved. There is also the problem in Indonesia, the bureaucracy doesn't work. The whole government is very low capacity to implement even the president's instructions. Yeah, I think that's our challenge. For example, yeah, how much money that the government put now to do this works? Yeah, from 2018's budget, annual budget, yeah, the central governments only provide about $571,000. The whole country, huge country, yeah.
Wow.
So the commitment is not translated enough into the new institutional arrangement. So that will be the challenge, Andy. Yeah. If the presidents and ministers say they will do this, yeah. In the case of Indonesia, even the presidents promise to have new law on indigenous peoples, new task force in the presidential office to do this work, but until now, nothing happened. Yeah, so that's on the challenge. So small budget and also only subdivisions in the Ministry of Forestry doing this work. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now the challenge is what we can do with this to deal with this. Yeah. From our experience with 10 million hectares of the indigenous territory that we already mapped, actually with participatory of the peoples, it's very cheap. We only need less than, it's about $2 per hectare to map. Yeah? And only 5,000 rupiahs, what is this? 30 cents to do verifications for hectares. Yeah. So if for now we still have to map 47 million hectares. So how much money we need? It's very small. Yeah. We only need 182 and 44.8 millions US dollar. 182 millions US dollar.
That's to map and to verify.
And, yeah. And a lot of money come to Indonesia, projects related to this forest, environment. I think it's very small.
It's very small.
If 20% of that money that come to Indonesia dedicated to this, I think we can make this in maybe 2 or 3 years from now. And 40 million hectares, the good forest that we have that store our carbon, yeah, that guard our biodiversity, we can really save. Yeah?
Wow. Okay.
So I think this is really Not really. I know this, the negotiations, billions US dollar now, right?
Yeah.
But indigenous peoples only need small things, small. But that would be, the systems have to be dedicated.
Yeah.
I think that's the solutions
Okay, so
from Indonesians' experience.
very interesting. Thank you, Abdon. Very quickly, what kind of support is there? You've mentioned the government is not putting money into it, except $500,000. But what kind of support from the development community? Are there investments from the development community in supporting the mapping and the registry and all of that?
I think the 100 million hectares that 10 million hectares right now. I think it's financed by community themselves, and also support from, I think, I don't know, here's someone later from the World Bank, right? There is a Japan Social Development Fund that we use to do this work for the last 3 years. And also the support from another donor, the support through Aman. Yeah, but it's too small.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and also it's too rigid. It's too, what do you call it? Too administrative. Yeah, I think it's more too much time for us to manage the money, not doing real mapping also. Yeah, so
Right.
I think we need change.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we can make a really significant change, we can speed. We can what do you call it? Accelerate.
Accelerate, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you, Abdon, for opening up this discussion with such a vivid example of the scale of the problem and the very real opportunity if the money and the institutions were aligned to support you. It's not a crazy, it's not a big amount of money, and you already have the protocols, you already have the systems, and in local governments, it sounds like, are already supporting. So huge. Okay, so I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience, and we can come back to you in Indonesia in a bit. And but thank you for opening up the conversation with that. So, Honorable Pratt, Commissioner Pratt, could you tell us about how this challenge manifests in Liberia? A bit smaller than Indonesia, but Liberia historically has punched above its weight in political influence in Africa, at least. And in fact, the new law, Community Rights Act, demonstrates again how progressive leadership can shift things. But tell us, how are you? What's the gap? What are you learning? Is there support or not? And what are your ideas about scaling up?
Thank you, Andy. I think once I've heard Indonesia's story, it makes me remember that our problems are not insurmountable. So Liberia's total land area is 9 million hectares. That's even less than what Indonesia has mapped. So the problem seems big to us in Liberia, but when we listen to some of our colleagues, we know that in a very short time, we can see tangible change. Now, Liberia last year enacted what we will say is a landmark legislation in support of customary land rights. For the first time in our country's 172-year history, we now have our customary communities that have recognized rights by the enactment of the law, and further, we are now in the process of securing those rights through a formal title and deed process. And that is not a small feat. So we have a good opportunity. We've passed this law. We've worked with civil society, with our donor partners, with our communities, but the implementation is where we find the major challenge and the major gap. And I'll explain some of the reasons why. there are two very progressive things that happened in Liberia. One was the passage of this law. The second was the legislation of the Liberia Land Authority, which became a one-stop shop for land administration. So from the government's perspective, we realized that the duplicity of functions, the lack of coordination in the land sector, we were not advancing our land reform agenda. Liberia does not have a progressive land information system. Land conflicts have been argued to be the next cause for civil conflict if we do not get a handle on the situation. So it was incumbent on the government to look at how we fix those problems. So the Land Authority was convened. But now you have an agency in its infancy. We're less than 2 years old, operationalized for less than a year, and now we've passed a landmark legislation, which was with our Congress for 4 years. And it took active lobbying with CSOs, with partners to pass this legislation. So we've passed this landmark legislation. We have a new agency, and government has no operational support. About 85% of the government of Liberia's budget is used to fund payroll, which means you have a legislation and you do not have the means to actually implement. Partnerships are the lifeblood for us. We will need these partnerships in order to implement this act. We recently, thank you to RRI and the tenure facility, recently have a project where 24 of our communities will go through this formalization process to receive their land rights. Now this 24%, it may seem small, but it's a significant number. About 60% of our land area is considered interior, arguably customary. We can go further and say that 60% interior, we can take 20% of what we consider coastal Liberia to add to that number. So if we're looking at roughly 80% of our country's landscape as being customary, that affects almost 3 million people. Liberia has a population of 4.6 million. We haven't had an official census since 2008, but these are estimates. So the 2017 World Bank estimate puts us at 4.6 million total population. Of that, about 60% is in the interior. And then we add the 4 or 5% that is urban but could argue customary land. So we're talking maybe 3 million Liberians could be affected by receiving titling and formal recognition of their rights. And why is this important? This is important because Liberia is also one of the countries that has had an increasingly large amount of foreign direct investment in the mining sector, extractive industries, that sits on customary land. So here's an opportunity with the right partnerships for our customary communities to receive the benefits, to receive the livelihood creation that is possible. But one of the issues we have is these customary communities were sometimes left out of these huge, large-scale concession agreements. So you have very large concession agreements that are not being actualized because they sit on customary lands. The customary communities were not part and parcel of that conversation. So when you come to a land and you find people there, what happens? Land disputes happen and a shutdown happens. So we've seen it two ways, and as a country, we have got to harmonize. We've got to find a way to address these situations because Liberia is a poor country, but very resource rich, and people live on those lands. People should be the center of this resource and this poverty alleviation. So the Liberia Land Authority is working with our partners. I want to say thank you to the partners that have worked with us and stepped up to the challenge. The World Bank is implementing several projects across land sectors in Liberia. The EU is working with primarily our civil society, which is helping to get the message out and do some of the practical work that the government is unable to do in the landscape, as well as the government of Sweden through CEDA, USAID, and of course, RRI and the tenure facility. And these are just direct project support to the land authority. There's a lot of work in this sector, but one of the challenges we also have is to coordination. And one of the reasons the land authority was founded, because there's a lot of goodwill, but it's not coordinated. So we see a lot of duplicity, we see a lot of duplication of efforts in this sector, and we're trying to get a holistic view of what the opportunities are, what the constraints are in moving the agenda forward. I think I'll stop there because I'm sure there will be more questions and more engagements.
Well, thank you, Ellen. I know I have more questions for you, but I think it's time to ask you in the audience. You've heard two compelling stories, one from Abdon in Indonesia, the other from Ellen and Liberia, one from an indigenous perspective, the other from the government perspective, but both from the citizen, patriot, believer in your country perspectives. Any questions or comments from you? Just wave your hand. Here we have Samuel Niguifo. Is there a microphone? Here you go. And then I can't see very well. Are there other? Okay, here we go. Over here. Okay, go ahead, Samuel, first.
Thank you. I'm Samuel Ngifo from Cameroon, and I would really like to thank both of you for explaining the situation in your two countries. I learned something from the two countries, that is not enough to recognize community rights. I think it's where the battle starts, right? When the rights are recognized, implementing it becomes also another challenge. But I would like to ask Honorable Pratt, since I also come from Africa, I come from Cameroon, how do you feel when in Liberia you have a law, you pass a law recognizing property rights to communities? When we talk to some ministers and government officials, especially in Central Africa, what they say is that if we give out the land, we are dispossessing the government. And we don't know if the communities are able to properly manage that land. So there is a need for us as government to keep our hands on the land. And my question is, what will you tell a government official from that part of Africa about your experience? What advice will you give? And my second question is in the implementation. You already said it, but I'd like to know if you have further plans to work with communities and NGOs to see the implementation of the law to see progress in the implementation of the law. Do you have more plans to involve communities and NGOs? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There were a couple more hands up, so why don't we take a few more questions? There was one over here, and then I saw one over here. Okay. Please let us know who you are. And
hello, my name is Erin Matson. I work for Climate Focus, an international advisory and think tank. My question is also for Honorable Ms. Pratt. You mentioned, so in the situation in Liberia with granting community land rights in the face of extractive concessions, in a previous session, we had just talked about how land rights are often talked about in terms of communities being able to defend their lands against extractive industry. But I was wondering, from your perspective, what balance do you have in both preventing negative impacts on the land through granting community land rights against capturing the benefits of utilizing the natural resources that the country has? So how do you balance that right to development and resource extraction with the importance of protecting the land itself?
okay, very good. Maybe we'll, please.
Thank
go
you
ahead.
very much. My name is Leah, and I'm from Indonesia. Sorry. I used to work for community-based forestry programs in Indonesia for Partnership for Governance Reform, and now I'm doing a research for participatory mapping for social forestry and the role of digital commons. So I think this question is for both panels, anyone who wants to answer. It's more to How do we accelerate the achievement of this target? Because for example, if we talk about the government of Indonesia example, I mean, for sure, like this is a matter of also trying to enclose resources that are very important. I mean, 80% of the land is the state forest, so it's a very important asset for the government. I mean, who have the resources have the power. But anyway, we have the first step has been achieved. We have recognition of the rights, but more things to do. And what I see also from the conversation is that there are so many other even legal frameworks or procedures that becomes an obstacle. For example, for participatory mapping, it's no longer a problem of cost, but it's also like, for example, that the fact that these maps, indicative maps that have been produced, have to be verified by the government in order to designate it as a forest that is owned or land that is owned by the indigenous communities or local communities. And even to do that, then they also have some other filters. Like, for example, they would only prioritize land that are already clean and clear status, which basically means that this land is free of conflict, which is, of course, another problem because most of the problem is there are conflicts in this land, so it's not clean and clear. So what can the development sector, the donors, and civil society organizations do in order to address this non-technical issue of mapping? I mean, mapping, there are so many innovations in the field. We heard the drone mapping now is being used, and also there is a discussion of how do we make, for example, participatory mapping by the communities themselves with the civil society organizations recognize so that you don't need, further process of, verification, which basically kind of slow down.
Okay, thank you. So you have 3 questions, and maybe Ellen, do you want to go first?
Thank you. So to the gentleman from Cameroon, your question is actually an excellent one and at the heart of why we proposed and protected and passed this legislation. So the first scenario I would give to a fellow government official is, how has government suppression of customary rights worked? Has it worked in your favor? And then I will give the example from Liberia. It has not, because one, we are signing agreements, the government is in control of customary land, and we're signing agreements on behalf of the residents of these lands, and they're not at the negotiation table. So we are signing agreements with companies that are not able to actually implement the work that they've come to Liberia to do, simply because of many of the land conflicts that they will find once they get on ground. And that has slowed progress. I'll give real examples. We have one oil palm company, the largest one in Liberia. We conceded 220,000 hectares of land. To date, they've been in operation for about 10 years, and they've only cultivated 6,000 hectares. So where is that leaving that development? Where does that leave those communities? So we say that the law is part and parcel of the people. Go to the people and you will see development happen. Go to the people and the land could be negotiated in good faith so that we all see a win-win to the situation. So we'll use that as the practical example, is what I would tell my fellow colleagues. There was a question about the do you have plans for the working with communities and NGOs? Yes. Liberia understands that with all of our resource gaps, resource capacity, financial, we cannot implement this law without the communities, without the NGOs, and without the CSOs. Again, practical example. The Liberia Land Authority has its head office in the center, in our city, our capital city, which is on the coast. We have 15 counties, and we have customary land in every county. The Land Authority does not yet have a strong presence in any of those counties, which means we have not decentralized those functions. If we have not decentralized, then to get the word out, to actually do the activities in the counties, we must rely on the CSOs that are in each of those areas. We must rely on the NGOs that work in those specific areas to partner with us to close that gap. Also, one of our constraints has been technology. We have a very manual system, land information system. I won't go into the technicalities, but we don't have the technology set up to actually remotely do a lot of this work. So there's a lot of ground truthing that will still have to happen in the interim as we test and pilot some of these systems and methodologies. And we cannot do it without partners in the field. So yes, part and parcel of our implementation arrangement is with our partners and communities. There was a question about the defense against the extractive industries or large-scale concessions. Many of the tenets in the law require that before concession agreements are signed, the communities must be involved. So it is no longer government to concession company or government to private sector. It includes the communities. And because of that, community governance structures have to be strengthened. We've recently validated two key pieces of legislation in support of this. One is the county land governance structures as it relates to customary communities, as well as the customary bylaws template. These are all tenets of the law that support the formalization process. So we've worked with the communities to effect these legislations, which now strengthen the governance structure so that communities are making informed decisions. FPIC is now a part of the law, and additionally, there's a vested interest that communities will receive from the concession companies in the law and as part of ongoing agreements. And this applies to new agreements as well as those that will be renegotiated. And I think I will let Abner answer.
Yeah.
I think the
Abner,
last
you want
two
to respond
questions?
quickly to the question about mapping, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, just a short comment to Cecilia about clean and clear. You know, clean and clear, I think from indigenous perspective is not really work for, because most of the indigenous territory already occupied by license and everything. And also, but we, of course, at least we help the government to make a cluster, what do you call it, stepwise approach, just to make that we start with the easier part and then to the difficult one. Yeah, we also realize that. But I think the challenge for us right now in Indonesia, it's very small staff in the ministry to do that. Yeah, and I think one of my recommendations is to help governments to increase their capacity in doing that work. Yeah, even to analyze the data, the information that we already provide. Yeah, so I think that's all the challenge. It's not about the clean and clear per se, but it's also if they can work deeply with the stakeholders on the ground, that will be really resolved. Yeah, but now they see the problem from Jakarta is too far from the real problems on the ground. I think the peoples on the grounds want to do like the dialogue how to resolve that kind of situations. Yeah, but different view from the governments at the centrals sometimes disrupt the process on the ground. Yeah, that's my reflections for that.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Abdon and Ellen, and opening the discussion. So now I'd like to invite our other colleagues to join us on the stage. Benoit Bladel will be appearing to my left, and Benoit Bladel is the Global Practice Manager of the Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economy Unit at the World Bank. He's been active in these topics for a long time. And he oversees the forest team and the teams that support this agenda in the World Bank from the forest and green side. So thank you, Benoit, for joining us. Also, Nonette Royo, here she is, very good. Thank you, Nonette. Nonette is the executive director of the Tenure Facility. She's familiar to many of you. She's been on the stage earlier today and I think yesterday. Before joining the Tenure Facility just over a year and a half ago or so, she was the executive director of Samdana, so a civil society organization in Indonesia, worked actively in Indonesia and Southeast Asia on these issues. So thank you, Nonette. And then Nicholas Soikan is a social specialist from the World Bank as well. Nicholas is somewhat unusual, maybe in many ways, but one of the ways that Nicholas is unusual is that he's now with the World Bank as a senior social specialist and working on these issues within the Forest Climate Partnership Facility. He's part of the social side, but before that he was with indigenous peoples organizations and lobbying, doing research and as an activist for indigenous peoples in Kenya and across Africa, and he's Maasai. So Soikan is here because he's got one foot in both worlds, and to help us think through the challenge of scaling. So these three people that have joined us, they're with organizations that are responsible to try to help Ellen and Abdon solve this. And so we'd like to hear from you. Maybe we'll start with you, Benoit. Can you characterize or tell us how the forest tenure reform work goes in the bank? How important is it to you, the bank? I know you've been in the bank for some time. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Are there new ideas about what to do? Can you update us from the forest side of the bank? How do you see these issues, and what are you or your team thinking about the scaling challenge, and what more you might be able to do? Benoit.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andy, for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure. It's a topic of significant importance to the World Bank, to everybody involved, from climate change to agriculture to environment, and also social aspects. It's also a topic that is particularly close to my heart, because this is where I started my work before the World Bank and at the World Bank on land tenure issues in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a topic that I find fascinating. So let me step back a little bit and tell you a little bit where we're coming from. And the bank is no stranger to significant land reforms, and this is what we're talking about. For those of you who are probably too young and may not remember, the bank supported a huge land reform program when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s. And the bank helped all those countries, almost all of those countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, to map, register the lands. So we have gained tremendous experience from that process. Those processes have been very helpful in all of these countries where it has been implemented. And I think it's important to draw some lessons from that experience. Clearly, today, the bank is not doing as much as on land reforms, land titling, land registration, as it did then. This was a historical opportunity and probably unique. But I think the challenge that you saw in your graph tells us this is the second wave. And what makes me optimistic, despite all the concerns and all the slowness and the administrative bottlenecks, is that we know what needs to be done and what are the key leverage points on which you need to act. So I would like to draw three lessons from our experience in the land reform programs following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first one is, we know things can move fast, okay? And they can probably move faster today than they did 20 years ago because of all the advances in drones, satellite, GIS technologies, but also social media that are incredibly important to make the process fair and transparent. The second is, this is not an easy reform. And necessity is the mother of all inventions. So you need to have commitment by the government to move forward. And until and unless you create those laws and you actually translate those laws into action, nothing is going to happen. We'd love to help more Indonesia in sorting out this land, access to land issues, but right now there's little demand coming from many governments to help with these issues. When there is explicit demand from the government, then the bank can step in. So what does that mean for us? We know that in the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, there was huge demand and political commitment. Have we reached that point here today when it comes to landscape and the indigenous land right? My sense is not quite yet. We are not quite there yet. I think among ourselves, we realize and we know the importance of this topic, but I don't think we have been able, except in too few instances, countries such as Liberia, been able to convince the general public and our politicians that this is a critical issue. So we need to go out there and we need to do the advocacy work and convince our policymakers in Cameroon, elsewhere, that this is we have solution to this problem, okay? We know how to do it, it can happen fast, but we need political commitment. And I think it will be very important for us to connect the dots between the latest IPCC report, the latest IPBS report, and the many other reports that shows that until and unless we do something about landscapes, in particular in terrestrial ecosystems, the world is heading for catastrophe, okay? So unless and until we change the understanding, raise the level of awareness, and mobilize the political commitment both among the general public and the highest level politicians, nothing is going to happen. And I cannot insist on that point enough. And then the third lesson I would draw is that we need to watch out for the political economy. Land reforms is not something that is neutral. Land reform is politically extremely significant. Why? Because it's about distributing assets and using resources in different ways, and about income distribution between oil palm companies and local communities. So it's extremely, so we shouldn't be naive in thinking that, oh, everything's going to be hunky-dory, we're going to do the land reforms, and it's going to be extremely easy. So we have, and we know that on landscapes, forested landscape, land restoration, etc., the income opportunities are going to rise even more, okay? Because land is going to get scarcer. People are starting to recognize the value of carbon sequestration, the value of all the ecosystem services that are provided by this landscape, and meaning that if we want to protect them, payments will have to follow, or market economy is going to have to adjust. So the political tensions are going to rise. So it's very essential that right from the beginning, we establish processes that mitigate this risk of plundering, of taking rights away from the local communities and indigenous people. So, even though the conversation was tough, I'm really encouraged by what I heard earlier. But I'm also encouraged that not only you mentioned the World Bank, but given our experience, we are putting in place the processes in countries to help with this problem. So I'm just going to name a few examples. In Ethiopia, for example, we just went to a board with a $500 million project a few weeks ago that will help finance land restoration and at the same time provide land titles to people. We have a relatively small facility called the DGM that provides resources to indigenous people to do what they think is their priority. And in Peru, in the Amazon, about close to a bit less than 1 million hectares is being registered in the name of the indigenous people. So things can happen. Political commitment is needed, and the bank is ready to do more. I think we're well placed to help at the dialogue level and at the investment level. At the dialogue level, because we have access, we can talk, we can convince the president and the ministries of finance, but we are also engaged with local communities on the field in building the capacity and in empowering them. And then we have a lot of capital and lending resources that we can put to good use in helping the land reform process that has got to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Yeah, very interesting, and that for me it tees up this question. You said that one of the key learnings, I think is number 2, was the importance of political will. So my mind immediately goes to, okay, in addition to doing projects, like you said, and having these issues in your projects, how is the bank thinking about using its political position in the world to increase demand from governments for this kind of thing? But maybe we'll come back to you in a bit, because I imagine others will be thinking along the same things. How is the bank thinking about getting more political, or using your political capital, if you will, to gin up more demand? But let's go to Nonette. Same questions, Nonette. Well, you just heard from Benoit that the bank's clients are governments, and he said that until they get a signal from governments, then it's difficult for them to act. And there's not yet a whole lot of governments that are coming to Benoit, especially through the ministries of forestry and environment, and saying, let us borrow money from you to do forest tenure reform. That means they're coming to you. So that means in countries where there's adequate legal framework, because the tenure facility can respond to Abdon and citizens. And that means if they're not going to, if the governments aren't going to the bank, the citizens are coming to you, because that's how the tenure facility was set up. So how are you? I know it's only been several years, but lots of experience already. You're already active in 14 or so countries, and impressive results so far. But so what are you learning about the position of the tenure facility in this ecosystem? How it relates to the bank, how it relates to Amman, how it relates to governments, and in your position and role in scaling up.
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, co-panelists. Yes, just to give you a bit of a summary of the amount of investment the tenure facility has put into this work, since inception, the tenure facility has put in a total of $22 million to 14 partners, averaging $1.5 million per year, per partner. So this is not a small player, but it is not big, the partners. And this is really capitalizing or picking up momentum from active organizations headed by indigenous peoples and in collaboration with civil society that's capable, alone or in collaboration with civil society that's capable to scale and to conduct this project of land registration and advancing, securing tenure. That is quite sufficient for the startup, but it generally, looking at all the countries that we had worked with, 14 now and going on increasing, there is a huge gap. Yeah, it still is considered a pilot. So it's to get government to really understand that this is doable. As Commissioner Pratt had said, it's doable, but we need to work together and build partnerships. So within some of these countries, the tenure facility partners are able to really have strong alliances with specific ministries, either Ministry of Forestry, Agriculture, or Environment, or the land registration authority or land authorities, looking at the specific processes and procedures to implement the legislative provisions that would enable this to happen, to work. So if you look at the kind of partners working on the ground in the field, we would have essentially picked up the momentum over the years to a total of 4.5 million hectares since inception. And if we add the area of the uncontacted people that also became mapped, that's 6.7.
Wow.
That is relatively big total, but still small overall, right? So we refer to all this data and we realize this is the beginning. It is something that has attracted, and the biggest, I think, lesson here is the relationship of government and indigenous peoples is one wrought with conflict and difficulties, but at the same time is matched by the intention to formalize on the part of the community and the intention of the government to actually deliver, because it is part of the mandate of the Constitution and the law. So that's the matching, the part, the alliancing part. The other important lesson is that resolution of conflict becomes very open, and in fact, many of the NGOs that we work with become part of the commissions, the committees that resolve or negotiate or talk about that land conflict. And in that it is, especially in Peru, it is very prominent. Yeah, that role. So I think I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Okay, very, very interesting. Thank you, Nonette. And for me, it's been a real revelation to see that the tenure facility, even though its mandate is to work with civil society, in almost all countries, the tenure facility, it's the civil society and the tenure facility that's partnering with governments. It's been a wonderful thing. And in your panel earlier today, there were representatives of governments and the civil society together. And I point that out because I recall in the early days of designing the tenure facility, quite a few of our colleagues who'd worked in the land reform for a long time, they said, you have to give the money, either the money to the government for land reform or give them veto power. Because as Benoit was saying, they have, of course, this is ultimately a political government thing. But we said, okay, but if the law is already passed, why not? So, and there, for one reason or the other, there's not will within the government to implement the law, but there is in civil society. Then empower civil society as citizens, and then they can bring their governments on board. So it's very interesting to see how this is played out in each country. I'm still thinking about scaling up. And how do we grow the number of countries and grow the number of governments that are really supported to either borrow from the bank or work with the tenure facility. So now I'd like to ask Nicholas Soikan his views on this. Again, you're in a unique position. You have been a leader of indigenous peoples organizations for years and a researcher before joining the bank. And have been there for a number of years as a social specialist. So you've been working on the inside, so to speak. So you're aware and learning, I guess, more than learning, you're still aware with how to help move the bank and what it can do on these issues. So could you tell us what you've learned about this challenge, the role of the bank, and beyond the bank, what can be done across these types of all these organizations to scale it up? And any particular ideas or recommendations? And then we're going to ask you to join us with some questions. I know we've got about 20 more minutes, I think, for this panel. So please, Soikan, give us your big ideas, your big comments, and then we'll ask for questions.
Thank you very much, and it's definitely easy to speak after one of my managers has spoken. So any questions to the bank, just direct them to Benoit. Just to say that while I'm here, I'm speaking for the World Bank, but I can assure you, Indigenous people's colleagues, that while at the bank, I speak for you. And my role as a social development specialist is really to ensure that social inclusions, participation of Indigenous peoples, proper social assessments are conducted in our forest and landscape program. So when I'm outside the bank, I speak for the bank. When I'm inside the bank, I go and speak for Indigenous peoples. And I think I have that unique opportunity, having worked with Indigenous peoples, and now really having those reflections within the bank and helping colleagues in terms of getting it right, in terms of consultations and so forth. I just came from Liberia, where we participated in launching of a free prior informed consent, so that all the concessions, all the discussions with forest communities are following specific guidelines. And we were there with Honorable Ellen when we were launching these free prior informed consent guidelines for Liberia. And on the topic, Andy, and how we are doing it, I must really say that securing rights is really securing an investment environment. So if you have secure rights for communities, if you have clear, land rights, then the investment environment becomes quite easy. Our work becomes very easy in that particular regard. And again, as Benoit has said, we've developed unique opportunities, including direct access of Indigenous peoples to funding through the dedicated grant mechanism under the Forest Investment Program, as well as the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, where there is a dedicated grant that goes directly to Indigenous peoples, implemented by Indigenous peoples. And so it's really trying to be innovative and creating and doing business not the usual way. By creating opportunities for partnerships. We will be working soon with RRI to help us create an opportunity map and do some analysis in terms of the forest trends and the land rights around it. So. But again, the most important thing in this whole discussion is the livelihoods of the communities. As we think landscapes, as we think forest reforms, as we think land reforms, we really must think about livelihoods of communities, because it's tied to each and every work that we do. And at the bank, we are looking at it and linking it to our twin objectives, which is reducing extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. So in all our programs that we are supporting in this particular space, we are trying to link it to in terms of reducing poverty. And again, as it was mentioned, we have now the new environmental and social framework, which is again an opportunity, for us to not only mitigate risk in our projects, but to provide opportunity for local communities, for Indigenous peoples in World Bank finance projects. So the new ESF is another very unique opportunity that I see really helping us in terms of how we do our work as we scale up all these various opportunities. And lastly, to say that what I heard from colleagues here, there's already a lot of good pilots out there. There's already good approaches, including what the TINIA facility has done. And therefore, in my opinion, is that let's not waste a lot of time reinventing and reinventing. Let us scale up good approaches that have been tested, but most importantly, that have been seen to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Thank you.
Well, I'll note that Soikan was the only one to get applause, but I'll just assume that that's for all of you, for all of us. And Soikan, I appreciate you mentioning this collaboration that we have underway with the bank now, that it's the first time we're doing something together like this, the study of the opportunities to scale up investments in securing rights. So that's, since I'm the moderator, I'm not supposed to be announcing things that we're doing, but I think that's a great example of the potential for partnerships and working together. So questions, comments from the floor, from you, and please announce your name, and then all of you on the panel take note and be ready to see what come up with. And maybe I'll ask if you particularly address to either Benoit, Nonet, or Soikan. Of course, if you have questions for Abdon and Honorable Ellen Pratt, then those as well. But since we've already had some questions of them, let's privilege for these three who are on the stage and in the world trying to solve this problem. Okay, who would like to go first? Kevin? Okay.
Thanks. Hi, Kevin Curry from the Ford Foundation and the Climate and Land Use Alliance. And I have a question about how the bank sees a relationship between its work on land and its work on forests. And to me, one of the exciting things about the Forest Action Plan that the bank announced in 2016 was a commitment to get forests out of their silo and to pursue forest-smart interventions across all of the bank's lending portfolio. And to me, one of the most forest-smart interventions around is to help indigenous peoples and local communities secure and defend their land and forest rights because of the overwhelming evidence that helps reduce deforestation and protect forests. But of course, forests and land sit in two different parts of the bank, and breaking out of silos is difficult. So I'm curious what kind of concrete changes have been put in place internally in the bank to help facilitate dialogue between the land team and the forest team. And maybe as a specific example of that speaks to the question of how the bank is mobilizing demand for land reform. The bank has been quite successful in the past in fundraising for its forest trust funds, and I'm sure will continue to be successful in those fundraising efforts. What would it take for the bank to commit to earmark a certain percentage of its future trust fund funding for forests to help secure indigenous and community land rights in forest regions?
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Other questions? We have Samuel here. We have a woman. Oh, is that behind you? Is that Grace? And then Samuel.
Yeah, I'm Grace from Tubtuba.
Oh, okay, Emily.
I think I have no question, but just to reiterate that securing land tenure is really one of the first steps that we need to do. But beyond that, for the countries or the communities who have already gotten their land titles or there is already recognition of land tenure, as Soikan had mentioned, it should go beyond securing the land title or the land tenure. It should be very supportive also. Programs should also continue to support the strengthening of livelihoods, support for livelihoods to really alleviate poverty in the communities, because having land tenure is not enough. And we need really support for both traditional livelihoods as well as alternatives and innovations in the long run to really respond to poverty, to the poverty situation of our communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Perhaps because I'm not seen and I have a mic.
Who's this? Who's speaking? Oh, okay.
So
okay.
my name's Kimaren Oleriamit and I come from Kenya.
Okay.
And I really want to appreciate the setup of the panel, indigenous people, non-state, and government together. It's an impressive setup, and we appreciate the insight. So my question goes to the World Bank. The first panel from Andy and the Commissioner demonstrated that we have seen a trend towards increased recognition of indigenous people rights on paper. But one of the greatest challenges we have, like the case of Kenya, we have a Community Land Act that recognizes indigenous and local communities' rights, but the transition is expensive, complex, and really difficult for communities to the extent that it almost makes it a nullity that the lands are recognized on paper. Some of these opportunities have time-specific windows, Like in Kenya, we have a historical land injustices window within which we should register our claims. It expires next year, but because it's expensive and a legal process, indigenous communities might lose this opportunity even though it's allowed in law. So my question is, I think most of the programs of the bank are focused on software, capacity building. The FCF, for example, land rights is an aspiration, but not a result like carbon sequestration. So the issue is, how do we really move to the next step of not just recognizing on paper, but translating recognition into actual ownership of land and benefit from this land?
Very good.
More direct access, perhaps, that is not through government, if it were possible. Okay. Thank you. And certainly the other facilities, the 10-year facility, is a thing we want to engage to see whether we can access these rights. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Let's take one more thing. Emily, I think you had your hand up. The microphone here in the middle of the room. Maybe if you stand up and wave. There we go.
Buenas tardes con todos.
Good afternoon. I am Silvana Valdovino, and I think we should highlight why this panel is so important, because we need to find out how things work. So to guarantee legal certainty of the rights of the indigenous peoples, we need financing, we need the intervention of the state and of different organizations.
Y si puede empezar otra vez, si...
Could you start again, please, a summary? What I wanted to highlight about this panel and our conversation is that I believe that one element that we need for the success of all these factors and in order to achieve legal certainty is flexibility and respect. The processes have to be flexible and respect has to be there at all levels of intervention. We cannot work without the indigenous peoples, without the governments either. So we need to find a formula for success, and it's important to replicate those flexibility and adaptation levels in every possible source for a cooperation that is trying to support the legal certainty processes. I think this is how we can achieve our success. We need to see how to adapt to the reality of any one of the parties involved. And this allows for the scaling up of those projects, for them affecting positively many communities and territories. And I think we should really, really highlight this because we need cooperation, we need alliances to keep working. The state still needs support, but we need to understand as well that we have to be flexible with the interested parties because otherwise we will not achieve our goals. So the processes have to be adapted to the realities in which we work. And this is something that we're reminded of in this panel. So I would like to highlight the roles of every party involved, the state, the communities, and of course everyone who has the capacity to support these processes.
Okay, thank you, Silvana. Then maybe over here, Emily, and unfortunately, maybe we'll take just one more because we want to make sure that we have time to respond to the questions because I think we have 6 minutes and we're supposed to clear the stage and make way for the next event. So here, Emily.
Thank you. My name is Emily Goranson. I'm from SIDA, the Swedish Government International Cooperation Agency, and we've been supporting RRI for a long time with core support and also the TF since the initiative was taken by RRI. And we feel that the 10-year facility is really filling a niche that no organization was filling before, and with time you will accumulate a lot of expertise from different countries. And what we have not mentioned or talked about here is how you will work. use all this information from different contexts and different countries and make sure that it reaches the different country processes and different actors, because your role is very specific, and that will bring a lot of knowledge to you. And then I also wanted to challenge Benoit that if in the countries where the tenure facility has worked with civil society, indigenous groups, and governments, and have found a way that really moves the agenda forward and brings titles to communities, do you think that that will be then a context where there's a possibility for the World Bank to actually scale up? As a donor, of course, we're always interested in scaling up. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take the last one over here. Samuel, is that quick?
Thank you. I just wanted to thank Benoit Blarel for letting us know what the bank has done and is doing on land tenure. I think it's very impressive to see what was done in Russia, and I think the magnitude of the task there is similar to what will be needed in southern countries that we are talking about. But I have the sense that we probably have more requests for land reform from government than what the bank is saying. We did an assessment of countries in Africa, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, and we realized that 2/3 of the countries were either in the process of a land reform or were just out of a land reform, which means there is a very clear need on the side of the government to get support. So I'm a bit surprised when you say that we still need to build some momentum to have this political will. I think it exists. I think what is missing is the solutions, how to properly address a land reform, including providing a solution to all the stakeholders, including the communities. I think this is, to me, the major problem. And coming back to the bank, and I will end there, I think the bank has a lot of opportunities to bring the issue of tenure on board. You have, well, the World Bank Group, not only the arm for which you work, but you fund projects in the private sector, and you also support government policies and programs. And the Honorable Pratt was saying earlier, the private sector cannot work, they cannot continue with their investment if they have conflicts. And I suspect you have the same type of experience. At least in my country, we see the same type of experience in World Bank funded projects. So it means there are opportunities for you to discuss tenure issues. So I will suggest, if you agree with that the bank starts an independent evaluation of what you do on tenure and what are the opportunities for doing more, and how you can take into account tenure issues in all the projects and programs that you fund in southern countries. This will be a way to contribute to scaling up, as discussed earlier. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Samuel, and my apologies to you on this side of the room that I think we're not going to be able to take your questions. Otherwise, we won't have time to let our guests respond. So maybe in 1 or 2 minutes apiece, your final wrap-up. So there maybe, Benoit, you can take a few more than 2 minutes, because you and Soikan, you had more of the questions. But then I think, do we have a break? We go from here to a break, correct? So is anyone going to chase us off the stage if we're 5 minutes over? No. Okay, well, that's reassuring. Then let's, most of the questions for you, but then I'd like to circle back and give each of you one last chance for a kind of a 1-minute wrap-up. Ellen, what are you taking away from this conversation, Abdon, et cetera? So why don't you Benoit, you, Nonette, and Soikan answer these questions, and then we'll close. Thank you. Benoit.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you. There are lots of very interesting and difficult, challenging questions to respond, so I'm going to let him respond to the difficult question, and I'll take the easy ones. No, more seriously. Look, Kevin, Stanley, Emily, Samuel, Silvana, thank you very much for the question. There's somebody who raised a question, but I didn't catch the name. There's the question of how much more can the bank do. So, as you all probably know, the bank is a demand-driven institution. We don't go in a country and do whatever we want. The demand has to be expressed, has to come from the government, and there's a memorandum of understanding, we call it a country partnership framework, that establishes the areas where the World Bank will help a particular country for a framework of about 4 to 5 years, and it's reviewed, updated every so often. Now, and this is so that we have to work with it in that environment, and sometimes land issues, land reform issues, etc., do not necessarily fall in there. Sometimes it's a priority for the government, but and this is particularly true in the IDA countries. IDA resources are very limited, and the government has many priorities and has to make a hard choice between the competing priorities. So that's a reality that we have to face with. And what I think also is that perhaps, and this is more introspective, the bank can probably act in different ways, intervene in different ways in the countries. And that's something I will touch upon in my concluding statements at the wrap-up session later on this afternoon. So I invite you to come at the wrap-up session so you will hear what I'm proposing, what I think the bank could do. Because clearly, I mean, to put it very bluntly, the challenges are huge, right? And we have approached this kind of systemic issue in a very transactional fashion. And this is not cost effective. We have to approach the countries and the problems and put in place the solutions that we know exist, even though they will differ according to the specific conditions, social conditions, land conditions, political and cultural conditions of individual countries, no questions about it. But we have to find a way to behave, for the bank to intervene in a much more cost-effective fashion, because the amount of ODA resources is very limited. So we have to be able to leverage much more through intervention, and I think we've got to move much more towards away from very transactional-oriented type of interventions towards more performance, results-oriented type of operations. And if we do that, I think we'll be able to have more of an impact at the national level and be able to leverage much more the bank resources than what we are doing currently. So I know there were lots of other questions, but I don't want to monopolize the floor here. Thank you.
Very good. Soikan?
Thank you very much. I don't think really have much to add on this. Maybe, Benoit, you can speak a little bit about the Forest Action Plan, that the question that the colleagues from Ford Foundation asked. But Grace, you are absolutely right that we need, and Stanley as well, that we need to move beyond capacity building and really have some actions in regards to the, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. That you are saying, but also you should be pleased to know that in fact Africa is ahead in terms of the signing of emission reduction purchase agreement. The DRC now has signed an ERPA. We have Mozambique, and we have a few other countries coming up in the first quarter, or actually towards the end of this calendar year. And therefore, there is some progress already. There are benefit sharing mechanisms that that are being put in place. If you look at the benefit sharing mechanisms, it includes indigenous peoples, private sector as well, in terms of the beneficiaries, for this. It's all in, I would say, in pilot phase, and partnership with you will be very critical in making sure that these benefit sharing mechanisms are respected, but are being implemented according to the emission reduction purchase agreement that is being signed by the Carbon Fund and the government. So, and again, we have an opportunity under the new environmental and social framework, as I mentioned, ESS 10, Environmental Standard 10, on Environmental and Social Standard 10 on stakeholder engagement, provide us with really a robust engagement framework, not only with indigenous peoples, but all the stakeholders relevant in this particular space. When it comes to forest, I don't see indigenous peoples and forest-dependent communities as stakeholders, but I see them as shareholders, because I know you are land owners, you're forest owners, and therefore the engagement mechanisms have to be in culturally appropriate mechanisms, and they need to really follow the protocols of indigenous peoples, including free, prior, informed consent, which is now explicitly mentioned under the ESS 7 of the new ESF. And therefore, I see a lot of opportunities and flexibility in terms of us applying these standards in a manner that will benefit indigenous peoples and local communities, and by extension, the project beneficiary. I think I will stop at that, and I don't know whether, Benoit, you want to go back on the Forest Action Plan question, which is more for you.
Yeah. No, not.
Just on the specific question from Emily, the answer is yes, and it's also not necessarily directly from the 10-year facility. It's demand-driven from the network. Sometimes it would be through the global alliances of indigenous peoples actively asking for these lessons learning, and in places where there are governments that are present, either global meetings or at national meetings where there's opportunity. Yes, so the answer is we will share these lessons, yes.
Okay, well, just listening to the conversation today, and I'm struck by Benoit's introduction of the Soviet Union. And then how the bank, and I'm now recalling, it wasn't only the bank, the bilaterals across Europe began to invest more in, well, I pay attention to the forestry and land investments, but many bilaterals, Germany, BMZ, Swiss had projects in Kyrgyzstan on forestry and tenure reform, and there was a big mobilization and a lot of partnerships in response. And it just, of course, struck me that, I guess this is, like Samuel said, maybe we need to mobilize something similar, think innovatively, like you said, in the face of this challenge. And it is urgent, as we all know. The forest that is not in the hands of communities is at greater risk of being deforested, right? So it's not a small challenge. So maybe we need a similar type of mobilization of effort and innovation as well. And again, it strikes me that there's a set of countries where there's not the demand yet for either maybe the 10-year facility or the bank that don't yet have the legal frameworks. So those are countries where more advocacy, more awareness, there's another set of countries where that do have laws that we need to figure out how to implement. Whether it's the bank, 10-year facility, somebody else, GIZ, BMZ, to scale that up. And then thirdly, figure out how do we coordinate among all of us for this wave, hopefully a wave of new investment to be coordinated and efficient, and all. How do we get smarter about scaling up? So those are three kind of takeaways from me from this conversation. So we'll go back around one last time, 1 minute. I've told you what I'm walking away with. What are you walking away with in terms of idea about next steps, things to do? you've heard the word partnerships, collaborate, et cetera, et cetera. What are you walking away with in terms of things to do to scale up? And what recommendations do you have for all of us that we do next? 1 minute. Start with Ellen and then go to Abdon and just down. And Soikan, you'll wrap up and take us home at the end of the session.
So again, thank you, Andy. Thank you to everyone here on this panel for this great convening. What I want to take away is just that Liberia is on a journey. And like our other African countries, our government is committed. We've recently launched the African Land Commissions for Customary Rights. And this is of high-ranking government officials. So we intend to spread the message. We intend to continue the momentum, but we ask that our partners join us. We ask that our partners work with government as well as civil society, as well as our other partner organizations, because it is a holistic and integrated framework that will advance land reform in Liberia and most of Africa. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ellen. This new network that you just launched, network of land ministries and land commissions across Africa for community land rights. I'm glad you brought that up. I thought that was amazing when I learned about it just several weeks ago. Abdon, what do we do?
What we do? I think the first, we have to invest more on rights. We have to increase really our energy to work, because if we invest more on the rights, I think we invest on certainty, because now our enemy to doing this, all recommendations from the big meetings is certainty. And uncertainty, that's our enemy. And that's come from these very basic problems that we have faced on the ground. Yeah. So I think that's the first. And the second, like for Indonesia, from our experience, they try to solve the problems in a separate room between forest and land, right? It's just like land is different and forest is different. No, forest is growing on the land. So we have to really put that in one box, not in a different separate box. Yeah, that's the second. And the third, I think we need to change the mainstream way to support indigenous peoples and local communities, to be more flexible, more show the respect, more respect, and then I think more dialogue, so we can really come to the real result, not only paper, no? Because we already, so much paper said about the commitments. Mm-hmm. Presidents in Indonesia committed to do this, so many things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The company also said, we committed to do this, but there is no actually the systems to say, oh, you are failed, you are a little bit better, and I think, but people just like freely to commit, to promise, to do, to pledge, but nothing happened at the end. Yeah? So I don't know if that systems we have. Yeah. So we can really say, no, you promised this, but you do only this, you know. Mm-hmm. If not, we will continue talking and talking and talking, and every meetings will produce more and more agenda, more and more. So that's my. So let's do something to make this work. Invest more on rights, because that will create a better whatever we want to do later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Abdon. And while you teased us earlier by saying you're going to announce something at the closing session,
right? And
now we're feeling cheated.
Oh no, so, I meant the other closing session.
Okay, the other. Okay.
Sorry. So I'll be very short.
Okay.
We can do it. When you hear all the experiences around the table, people know what needs to be done. It has been done. and we know what needs to be done. We know what works, we know what doesn't work, we know where the pitfalls are, etc. But there's no magic bullet, and it's not one institution that is going to solve the problem. It's going to take, sorry to sound a bit repeating somebody else's word, but it's going to take a village to solve the problem. And we have to work in partnerships together to solve the problem. The solutions are known. We just need to implement it, and we need to convince the right people and raise the level of awareness.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. What I can say is rely on the people that have been protecting these landscapes, use land use arguments, so because the protection, the body of knowledge has already emerged, how important and how significant the protection is of land managed by people. Title can come maybe later. The process of advancing it at the very beginning enables the actors to sit on the table and plan together at district, province levels. Once they have these voices, they nail these arguments even prior to title. So begin there and expand and use other sources of funding and consider co-investing in these assets that indigenous peoples already have and protect.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. So just in a sentence is to say for us to scale this ambition, for us to address climate change challenge, we really must work with each other, and we must leverage on each other's strengths for us to be able to address this challenge. And we really need to break the knowledge silos, and we need to promote each other's good practices, learn from each other, leverage each other's strength, and have this done together.
Well, good. Well, thank you. And thank all of you. And please join me in a round of applause. Thank you, Ellen, Abdon, Benoit, Nonet, Swakan. So, and thank all of you again. Okay.